Hi, I'm Edward, and welcome to Marxists at the Movies. I'm proud to introduce this project, created with the help of my AI team. You won't be hearing my voice just yet. Instead, two AI hosts will guide you through the stories, struggles, and revolutionary sparks hidden in the films we know and love. Thanks for being here, and enjoy the show.
This is the Marxists at the Movies podcast.
Scene opens, white lights dim down low. The cinema whispers where truths can grow. From shadows deep and screens ignite, the proletariat comes alive tonight. Marxists at the movies, bright and raw, breaking through the reels to rewrite the law. Workers of the world in every frame, changing the credits, rewriting the name.
All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Marxists at the Movies. Here we go.
That's us.
And this time, seeing as it's International Workers' Month, we thought we'd get a little, well, dialectical.
As one does.
We're putting on our, comically oversized theoretical glasses and peering intently at something you might not expect.
Mm-hmm.
The 1994 cinematic triumph, Baby's Day Out.
Oh, boy. That one.
Now, fair warning, comrades, we're going deep, really deep. So if you haven't seen this 90s masterpiece, well, prepare for spoilers.
Yeah, spoilers aplenty. Like, more than you'd find in a leaked Pentagon memo, maybe.
Possibly.
And our guide for this particular, let's say, expedition into the seemingly innocent world of a crawling infant.
Who is it?
It's going to be Edward Michael Francis's article, Baby's Day Out, A Revolutionary Toddler's Journey Through Class Warfare.
Okay, that title alone tells you we're in for something.
Right. We'll be using his, shall we say, interesting perspective as our main lens, but we'll also be pulling in bits and pieces from other places.
Like?
IMDb, Vern's reviews, always a treat, Vern.
Always.
And even some more academic-leaning texts to sort of flesh out the analysis.
Right. And you, our ever-thoughtful listener, you actually brought this Flick and Francis's take to our attention.
Which, gotta say, immediately piqued our interest.
Totally. It's the kind of suggestion that makes you pause and go, wait, Baby's Day Out? Really?
Uh-huh. But that's exactly why we're here, right? To see if even the fluffiest seeming cultural artifacts can actually hold up a mirror to the way things really work.
For sure. We were aiming to give you a thorough understanding, unpack the layers, but without making your brain feel like it's been through one of those slapstick routines itself.
Hopefully not. We want insight, not concussion.
Exactly. So let's get into it. Baby's Day Out. What were the initial vibes? How did people react when this thing first came out? Francis kicks things off by noting a pretty stark divide.
Yeah, that's a really crucial starting point, actually. Francis highlights that while it was largely shrugged off, dismissed as just goofy, maybe saccharine nonsense in the U.S., it's somehow morphed into this, cult phenomenon internationally, particularly in places like India and Southeast Asia.
Oh. Okay, that right there, that immediately raises a red flag or maybe a red banner, given the theme.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, right? What did audiences in other parts of the world see that American critics and maybe audiences largely missed?
Absolutely. And Vern, oh, bless his cynical heart, he certainly aligns with that prevailing U.S. sentiment. His review paints this picture of a film that not only bombed financially,
big time flop,
but was also, in his view, fundamentally unfunny. Just not funny.
Yeah, he really hammers that point home.
He even goes so far as to suggest it might have marked a kind of breaking point, a downturn in how people saw John Hughes, of all people.
John Hughes, the guy behind Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller.
Right. To say this movie dented his reputation, that's a pretty harsh assessment.
He doesn't mince words, does he? Vern rarely does. But it's fascinating, like you said, to juxtapose that with the fact that even on Vern's own review page, you find people pushing back
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's a commenter, username Pacman 2.0,
Okay.
who mentioned genuinely loving the film back in '94, praised its mischief construction, which is a great phrase.
Mischief construction. I like that.
Right, and even hinted that there was something kind of subversive about it, this idea that maybe the sheer absurdity, the over-the-top nature, might actually be a commentary in itself. That's definitely something to chew on.
It really is, that maybe the pointlessness is the point, or something deeper.
Could be. And if you dip into the IMDb user reviews, you find a similar split, maybe leaning a bit more positive overall than Verne, perhaps.
Oh, so.
Well, one featured review calls it ludicrous but cute and very funny. Basically sums it up as Home Alone with a baby.
Okay, that comparison seems inevitable.
Totally. And this reviewer acknowledges, yeah, the plot is preposterous, maybe it's too long, but they still found real enjoyment in the slapstick, the pure physical comedy.
So you've got this critical drubbing in the U.S., at least initially, versus this surprising international adoration, and then a segment of domestic viewers who are like, no, actually, this is pretty fun.
Exactly. And this kind of confusion, this mixed reception, it sets the stage perfectly for Francis's, well, let's call it his unique interpretation.
His Marxist deep dive into toddler antics.
Precisely. So let's dive into the plot as Francis sees it through his decidedly Marxist-tinted spectacles.
Lay it on us.
Okay, so on the surface, as most folks probably remember if they saw it, it's a pretty straightforward setup. You've got baby Bink.
The titular baby.
The titular baby. Heir to this massive fortune, living in, absurd luxury. He gets kidnapped, snatched by three, let's say, less than competent criminals.
Bumbling is probably the word.
Bumbling is generous, maybe. But here's the twist. Bink, being this resourceful, though entirely unintentional little revolutionary, he manages to escape. And then spends this chaotic day just crawling his way through various slices of working-class life in Chicago.
Right. The zoo, construction site, department store.
All of it. And right away, Francis latches onto Bink himself as a symbol. He's not just a baby. He's pure privilege personified.
Okay.
The living embodiment of inherited wealth, completely insulated, completely untouched by the struggles that, most people face every single day.
And what's particularly striking, reading Francis's take, is how Bink manages to survive this urban adventure. Because it's certainly not through any conscious effort or skill on his part. He's a baby.
Exactly. He's just crawling, following his picture book sometimes. As Francis astutely points out, Bink's safety net throughout all these escapades, it isn't woven from his family's millions. No. It's the everyday working people he encounters. The bus drivers, the store clerks, the zookeepers, the construction workers, who, just in their routine activities doing their jobs, inadvertently shield him from harm. They create the path for him, clear obstacles, deal with the kidnappers without even knowing it.
Wow.
And Francis delivers this fantastic, almost like a punch-to-the-gut line about it. He says, the rich may build their safety nets with money, but Bink's net is made of laborers.
Oof.
Yeah. And then he adds, and not a single one is thanked.
That really hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? That idea. It's this symbolic choreography, as Francis calls it.
Yeah, I love that phrase.
It is good. We're the essential workers of society, completely oblivious to who this kid is, his status, his wealth. They are the very people ensuring the survival of the elite's offspring.
Just by going about their jobs, clocking in, clocking out.
To the engine of capitalism, just churning away, right? Huh. Supporting those at the top without even a nod of acknowledgement, without even realizing they're doing it.
As Francis puts it so succinctly, that's capitalism in a nutshell. This, inherent, often totally invisible reliance of the privileged on the labor, the unpaid care, almost, of the working class.
Unpaid and unacknowledged.
Totally. And this dynamic, it becomes even more pronounced, maybe even more literal in the now iconic guerrilla scene.
Yes, the guerrilla.
Yeah.
Probably the most memorable part for many people.
Definitely. So the hapless kidnappers, Vico, Norby, and Eddie, in a moment of just truly spectacular ineptitude.
Standard for them by this point.
Pretty much. They find themselves trapped in a gorilla enclosure at the zoo. And what happens?
The gorilla. Who's just chilling.
The caged gorilla, right. A creature arguably dehumanized by its captivity, forced into this enclosure for people to gawk at. It suddenly turns protector of the baby, who has somehow crawled in there too, and unleashes this primal fury on the would-be captors.
And Francis naturally doesn't just see this as, a funny animal attack gag.
Oh, absolutely not. He interprets the gorilla as, wait for it, the proletariat unleashed.
Wow. Okay, explain that.
Well, think about it from his perspective. The gorilla is stripped of its freedom, forced into confinement, much like, he might argue, the working class under capitalism. Caged, exploited.
Right.
But when provoked, when pushed too far by these representatives of misguided capitalist ambition...
The kidnappers trying to profit off the baby.
Exactly. The gorilla becomes this force of raw, untamed power. Brutal, decisive, unbothered by niceties, as Francis puts it.
He calls the gorilla the beast of burden turned enforcer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Love that. This force doesn't politely request justice. It enacts it. With extreme prejudice, you might say. Lots of throwing around.
And Francis even draws this line, this connection to other figures in cinema who represent the oppressed turning on their oppressors, like King Kong or Frankenstein's monster.
Which is a pretty compelling connection, right? Maybe slightly wild, a bit of a stretch for some, but it makes you think about the symbolism of the caged animal fighting back.
It definitely adds a layer you probably didn't consider when you first saw it as a kid.
For sure. Okay, so now let's shift our focus a bit. Let's talk about the Three Stooges. The kidnappers. Eddie, Norby, and Vico.
Played by Joe Mantegna, Joe Pantoliano, and Brian Haley.
Right. Francis makes an interesting distinction here. He doesn't paint them as part of the capitalist elite, obviously. They're not the Cotwells.
No, definitely not.
He sees them as lumpenpoles, the sort of down-and-out, dispossessed individuals scraping by. We see their apartment, it's crumbling, dilapidated.
Yeah, they're clearly struggling. They're not living the high life.
Exactly, and their motivation. It isn't some grand ideological crusade against the wealthy Cotwell family. It's much, much more basic.
Good old-fashioned greed.
Bingo. Good old-fashioned greed. They're after the ransom money, pure and simple. It's a fundamentally capitalist pursuit, right?
Trying to get rich quick.
They've bought into the system's logic. Wealth equals happiness. Success is measured in dollars. And they're trying to get their slice of the pie, albeit through decidedly illegal and, frankly, incompetent means.
Okay, so they're lumpen proles trying a capitalist scheme. What about the constant stream of injuries, the slapstick, the endless humiliations they endure throughout the movie?
Yes. The kicks, the falls, the fire, the goo.
It's relentless.
It is, and Francis sees this as more than just, comic relief or cartoon violence. He argues it symbolizes, and this is another great quote, the self-defeating nature of capitalist ambition from below.
Say more about that.
Well, his point is, these are individuals trying to play the capitalist game. They're trying to get ahead using the system's own tools, money, leverage, kidnapping for profit. But they lack any real power, any real resources, any real intelligence, frankly.
They're trying to exploit the system, but they're at the bottom of it.
Precisely. And as a result, they're constantly getting battered and bruised by the very system, or at least the environment shaped by it, that they're trying to manipulate. Their ambition just leads to pain and failure.
So it's a rather bleak interpretation, really. Almost tragicomic, despite the cartoonish suffering. Their attempts to climb the ladder just result in them falling off it repeatedly.
Yeah, it really highlights this idea that when you try to operate within a system designed to concentrate wealth and power at the top, and you're starting from the bottom with nothing but a half-baked plan, your efforts are often going to be met with resistance. And in this case, that resistance takes the form of, well, a whole lot of physical comedy. Groin shots included.
They're chasing the capitalist dream, but keep tripping over their own feet, and often getting hit somewhere painful for their trouble.
That sums it up pretty well. Okay, so let's turn our attention for a moment to the folks behind the camera, because John Hughes looms large here, even though he didn't direct.
Right. We all know Hughes as the maestro of those iconic 80s teen films. 16 Candles, Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller.
The king.
But Baby's Day Out was actually directed by Patrick Reed Johnson. Hughes served as writer and producer.
Yeah, and Vern, in his review, gives us some interesting background on Johnson. He mentions in his typically colorful language Johnson's background in visual effects.
Oh, really?
Yeah, apparently he worked as a miniature model maker on films like 2010 and Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Huh. Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense when you think about the movie.
Right. It helps explain the film's almost cartoonish visual style, the very physical, effects-driven nature of the comedy. It's described as a big live-action cartoon with FX by ILM, Industrial Light and Magic.
Wow, ILM worked on this.
Apparently so, which explains why some of the gags, however silly, look technically quite polished.
That connection to practical effects and miniature work, it really resonates with the film's whole aesthetic. It's a very tangible kind of visual comedy, not just CGI everywhere.
Definitely feels very 90s in that respect.
Yeah.
And Verne points out, pretty obviously, the inspiration from those old Popeye and Sweepy cartoons.
Oh yeah, the baby constantly getting into danger.
Right, where babies routinely found themselves in these incredibly perilous but ultimately humorous situations, usually involving Bluto getting clobbered.
Like Little Sweepy or Child Psychology.
Exactly, those ones Verne mentions. But Verne also raises a valid point, I think. He talks about the difference between watching an animated character like Sweepy in danger versus watching a real infant seemingly in danger.
Yeah, that can be uncomfortable.
It definitely colored his viewing experience. He found it less funny, more unsettling because it's a real baby. Even though, logically, the baby actors were perfectly safe during filming. There were twins, safety measures.
Of course. But that perception of vulnerability is totally different. What might be hilarious when it's ink and paint can feel genuinely stressful when it's a real kid, even in a comedy.
For sure. But then again, that commenter, Pac-Man 2.0, back on Verne's review.
What did they say?
They throw a wrench in the works again by suggesting that maybe that very juxtaposition, the cartoonish scenarios happening to a real baby, maybe that's part of what gives it its strange, almost accidental, satirical edge. Maybe the discomfort is part of the point.
That's an interesting angle, leaning into the absurdity.
Could be. Verne also delves into some alleged behind-the-scenes drama. He mentions some apparently rather significant clashes between Hughes and the director, Patrick Reed Johnson, during post-production.
Oh, juicy.
Yeah, apparently it got heated enough that Hughes even bailed on the project for a while, just walked away.
Wow. I didn't know that. Wonder what they were fighting about.
Verne doesn't specify, but it suggests maybe creative differences, control issues. Who knows?
Yeah.
And interestingly, Pac-Man 2.0 chimes in again on this.
This commenter is really adding layers here.
They really are. Pac-Man 2.0 mentions that Johnson himself has stated on Twitter that a director's cut of Baby's Day Out exists.
Oh, wait, a director's cut of Baby's Day Out.
Apparently so. Now, one can only imagine what that version might emphasize or change. Would it be darker, weirder, more focused on the social stuff Francis sees?
It certainly hints at a potentially different vision for the film, doesn't it? Was Johnson aiming for something a bit more nuanced, maybe? Leaning more into the absurdity or the potential social commentary that Francis later picked up on?
It's one of those tantalizing what-ifs of cinema history. What could have been?
Definitely. Now, there's an academic text, Refocus, the films of John Hughes, that offers some broader context on Hughes's career around this time.
Right, because this film feels quite different from his teen stuff.
Very different. The book touches on his early days in advertising, before filmmaking. It suggests he had this really sharp, maybe even cynical understanding of the marketplace, of what would sell to an audience.
Okay, that tracks. He knew how to push buttons.
Yeah. And it also mentions this interesting tidbit about his early directorial efforts.
Yeah.
Apparently, he preferred casting relatively unknown actors because, according to the book, he reasoned they would be less likely to see that he was an amateur.
Huh. That's a fascinating glimpse into his early mindset. A certain level of self-awareness, maybe even a bit of, imposter syndrome, despite his obvious talent for tapping into the zeitgeist.
Could be. It makes you wonder how that pragmatic, market-conscious side of Hughes might have intersected with, or maybe clashed with, the more anarchic, almost nonsensical elements of Baby's Day Out.
Yeah, was he just trying to make a hit, or did he see something else in it? Hard to say.
Okay, let's start drawing some connections now. Other films, the wider cultural moment this thing landed in. As that IMDb user review pointed out, and as we've kind of touched on, the immediate obvious comparison is Home Alone.
Unavoidable. Kidnapping plot, bumbling criminals, kid outsmarts them through traps and physical comedy.
Right. It's essentially the same basic premise, but swap the wisecracking Macaulay Culkin for a crawling baby.
And Verne wholeheartedly agrees with this. He flat out calls Baby's Day Out a blatant attempt to cash in on Home Alone's phenomenal success just a few years earlier.
Can't really argue with that logic, can you? The formula seems pretty clear.
No, the connection is undeniable. Both films hinge on a seemingly vulnerable protagonist outsmarting a pair, or in this case a trio, of idiotic criminals through escalating physical comedy. But as Francis's analysis really highlights, if you look closer, the underlying social and economic contexts are actually drastically different.
How so?
Well, think about it. Kevin McAllister in Home Alone is defending his comfortable, suburban, upper-middle-class home. It's about protecting private property, the family unit within that specific setting.
Okay.
Baby Bink, on the other hand, isn't defending anything. He's unintentionally wandering through the working-class landscape of a major city. The threat isn't just to him, but implicitly to the continuation of his family's inherited wealth and status. And his protection comes from that landscape, not from defending a specific space.
That's a really interesting distinction. Same basic plot mechanics, maybe, but totally different social geography.
Exactly. Verne also throws in some wonderfully random summer of 1994 connections, just for fun.
Like what?
He meets that, just like the Julia Roberts, Nick Nolte movie I Love Trouble, Baby's Day Out is set in Chicago.
Okay, Chicago represents.
And even more specifically, the kidnappers' grotty hideout has a window that apparently bears a striking resemblance to a window in Eric Draven's apartment in The Crow, which also came out that summer.
Wow. That's some deep-cut trivia right there. The Verne Cinematic Universe.
It's a fun little bit of cinematic connective tissue, right? Even if Verne playfully suggests they all exist in some bizarre shared universe where Joe Pantoliano plays different characters, it just grounds the film in a specific time and place, 94 Chicago, even if the events themselves are completely bonkers.
It really does. Okay, circling back to the more academic perspective for a second. That refocus. The films of John Hughes' book helps us trace his evolution, right? Moving from those defining teen movies of the 80s into the more family-oriented comedies of the 90s. Home Alone, Dennis the Menace, Baby's Day Out.
Yeah, it was a definite shift in his output as a writer-producer.
And this shift, apparently, coincided with a broader trend in American family cinema during that decade. There's another article, this one from a journal Universitas Gadjah Mada, discussing the commodification of values in 90s family movies.
Commodification of values, what does that mean?
It argues that many popular family films of the 90s seem to be pushing this return to more, quote-unquote, traditional family structures and values. This came after what was perceived, rightly or wrongly, as a more turbulent and individualistic 80s, maybe with rising divorce rates, anxieties about family breakdown.
So these films were selling a certain image of family.
Kind of. The article argues that films like Home Alone, Baby's Day Out, Mrs. Doubtfire, even something like Jingle All the Way, they achieved popularity and financial success partly by presenting these idealized, harmonious families, or at least families striving towards harmony with clearly defined roles within the household. They were essentially selling a nostalgic, perhaps conservative image of the traditional family back to the audience, packaging values.
Huh. So Baby's Day Out, with its super rich nuclear family, fits right into that trend, maybe, despite the chaos.
Potentially, yeah. Although the parents are barely in it.
True. Interestingly, there's another piece, this one more humorous, called The Case for Watching Three Men and a Baby and Baby's Day Out back to back.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It offers yet another lens. It humorously frames the late 80s and early 90s around this perceived cultural conflict. Baby versus single men.
Baby versus single men.
Yeah, reflecting anxieties about, changing gender roles, wealth, maybe the lingering effects of 80s yuppie culture. It suggests that films like Baby's Day Out, where grown men, the kidnappers, are comically inept and terrified when faced with handling a baby, might have resonated with, or at least amused, the generation of men who were perhaps feeling insecure about domesticity or fatherhood, or were just coming into positions of power at that time. A sort of look how clueless other guys are vibe.
Wow. So you could read it as reinforcing traditional gender roles, too, in a weird way.
Yeah.
Men are useless with babies.
Possibly. It's this really fascinating tapestry, isn't it? You've got all these different interpretations floating around. Is it a straightforward attempt to replicate Home Alone? Is it part of a trend promoting traditional family values? Is it reflecting anxieties about gender and wealth? Or is it something else entirely?
And it's against this backdrop, this sort of cultural confusion and varying interpretations, that Francis's Marxist reading really starts to gain traction, maybe.
Exactly. He argues that the very ambiguity of the film, the fact that critics couldn't quite pin it down, couldn't agree if it was funny or terrible or just weird, that actually allows its accidental class commentary to shine through more clearly.
How so?
Because it wasn't trying to make some profound political statement. It was ostensibly just a silly slapstick comedy. So Francis argues its unintentional revelations about class, about labor, about privilege, they become all the more potent, all the more revealing, precisely because they weren't deliberate. They're just there. baked into the premise.
The system revealing itself through nonsense.
Kind of, yeah. Okay, let's delve into some more specifics now. The actors, the characters, those really memorable or maybe infamous plot points.
Right. Baby Bing himself, as we mentioned, played by twins, Adam Robert Wharton and Jacob Joseph Wharton. Cute kid.
Very cute kid. And the trio of kidnappers, the foils, Joe Mantegna as Eddie, Joe Pantoliano, Joey Pants as Norby, and Brian Haley as Vico.
Now, that IMDb review we talked about earlier, the one calling it ludicrous but cute, specifically highlighted Mantegna and Pantoliano.
What did it say?
Pointed out that these are actors often associated with more serious roles, maybe gangster parts, definitely more profane characters. Think Glenn Ross for Mantegna or The Sopranos later for Pantoliano.
Right, tough guys.
Exactly. And here they are, playing against type in these much broader, more comedic, and surprisingly less profane roles. Apparently, the reviewer thought Mantegna, in particular, showed some real comedic chops.
That's interesting. Seeing them do pure slapstick must have been a change of pace.
Yeah, it speaks to the film's overall comedic approach, right? Aiming for that broad, almost cartoonish humor that didn't necessarily rely on edginess or swearing to get laughs. Family-friendly, despite the premise.
Vern, however, surprise, surprise, has a somewhat less charitable view of their performances.
Let me guess. He hated them.
Pretty much. He describes their acting as mostly consisting of, quote, screaming and shrieking and running around and getting hit and falling down. Just pure physical bumbling, no subtlety.
What is that kind of movie?
It is, but it really underscores how subjective comedy is, doesn't it? What one person finds hilarious physical comedy, another person might just find grating and repetitive.
Totally true.
Yeah.
What about the parents? The Cotwells.
Ah, yes. Played by Lara Flynn Boyle and John Neville. As Vern keenly observes, they are surprisingly peripheral to the central action, like really peripheral.
They bookend the movie, basically. Freaking out at the start, relieved at the end.
Exactly. They have relatively little dialogue, minimal screen time compared to the baby and the kidnappers, which, Francis might argue.
What would Francis argue?
That this further emphasizes the baby's journey through the working class world. His survival depends on that world, not on his parents. Their wealth can't directly protect him once he's out there. Their presence is almost irrelevant to Bink's actual hour-by-hour survival on the streets. It's the chance encounters with everyday laborers that keep him safe.
So the parents represent the detached upper class, unable to function outside their bubble.
Something like that, yeah. And the nanny, too. Played by Cynthia Nixon, actually.
Pre-Sex in the City.
Way before. While she's a figure of authority and obviously frantic with concern, she also doesn't fundamentally alter Bink's independent trajectory once he's escaped. He's largely on his own path, albeit inadvertently guided and protected by those unseen hands of the working class as he crawls through their spaces, the department store, the bus, the zoo.
Okay, key plot elements. Let's tick some off. Bink's initial escape. How does that happen again?
It's triggered by his fascination with a pigeon, right? He sees a pigeon land on the windowsill while the kidnappers are distracted, and he just crawls out after it.
Which is maybe a bit symbolic itself. This incredibly privileged child, attracted by something simple and commonplace, blindly wandering out of his safe bubble into the unpredictable realities of the real world.
Could be. And this sets off the extended chase sequence that makes up most of the movie. Across the city, over rooftops.
Onto that public bus where the lady basically adopts him for a bit.
Yeah. Through the department store, the zoo, and even scaling that skyscraper under construction near the end.
Which logically makes zero sense, but visually.
Visually, it's quite something. And all of this culminates in a truly impressive or maybe depressing catalog of slapstick injuries for the poor kidnappers, as Vern meticulously recounts.
Oh, I bet he loved listing these.
He did. Kicks to the groin multiple times, a running theme.
Of course.
Being drooled on by the baby, that rather unpleasant encounter with the gorilla we discussed, being hit with a sledgehammer accidentally, plummeting from significant heights off buildings.
Doesn't Norby fall like 5 stories onto concrete?
Yes, and then gets up. And Vern makes this dark little aside about that moment. When Norby falls off the skyscraper near the end, it looks like he should be dead, right? But Eddie and Vico barely react. They're just annoyed he lost the baby again.
Huh.
Vern suggests it adds this layer of almost nihilistic absurdity to the humor. It's so cartoonish that the potential for real-world consequences, like death or permanent injury, is just completely ignored for the sake of the gag.
Total cartoon logic. They'll be fine in the next scene, maybe with some soot on their faces.
Exactly. They even survive a dip in what appears to be like industrial waste or wet cement or something. The sheer escalation of their misfortunes is definitely a defining characteristic of the comedy. Over the Top doesn't begin to cover it.
What about the book, the Baby's Day Out book that Pink has?
Ah, yes, the picture book. That becomes a surprisingly effective, if simple, plot device. Bink keeps recognizing places or scenarios from his book The Zoo, the construction site, the big clock, and tries to follow along.
And the kidnappers keep finding pages he drops, or realizing he's following the book.
Right. It inadvertently leads the kidnappers into further traps, while also providing a loose structure for Bink's chaotic journey through the city. It's a simple, but kind of clever way to string together the narrative. And his little catchphrase, boo-boo, referring to the book.
Yeah, that's his main motivation, finding the next boo-boo.
It drives the plot in its own strange way.
And the gorilla scene, we've touched on it a lot, but it really is not just a memorable set piece, but a key point of analysis for Francis and anyone else looking for, deeper meaning.
Definitely. Vern's description of the scene is pretty funny, too, highlighting the kidnappers' increasingly frantic attempts to distract the gorilla once they're trapped, offering it a banana, trying to reason with it.
Oh, that's going to work.
It really highlights their utter incompetence, especially when faced with this raw, untamed power, which, again, Francis interprets as that force of proletarian justice. It adds such a provocative layer to what might otherwise be dismissed as just a silly animal attack.
Then there's the construction site scene. That IMDb reviewer felt it dragged on a bit too long.
Yeah, it's a long sequence, but again, from Francis' perspective, it's another prime example of Bink navigating a quintessential working-class environment. You see all the construction workers just doing their jobs, welding, carrying beams, operating cranes.
And they unknowingly ensure his safety, right? A falling beam misses him, a worker moves something out of his path.
Exactly. They're creating a safe passage for him through their daily routines while remaining completely unaware of who he is or the absolute chaos he's causing just by crawling through their workspace. The invisibility of the elite child within the landscape of labor.
And the ending, how does it wrap up?
Well, after the construction site ordeal, the kidnappers are finally caught, thanks to Bink inadvertently leading the police and his parents to their hideout while following the final page of his book. And Bink himself ends up safely back in his opulent nursery.
Right back where he started.
Exactly. Seemingly undisturbed, maybe even unchanged by his wild urban adventure. It brings us full circle to that starting point of immense privilege, completely insulated and untouched by the realities he briefly encountered.
Back in the bubble.
Almost like it never happened for him.
Pretty much. And Vern also mentions, thankfully perhaps, the unrealized threat of a sequel. Apparently, there was a tease at the end or in promotion for Baby's Trip to China.
Oh, God, no.
Given the original's critical reception and box office performance in the U.S., we probably dodged a bullet there.
Yeah.
The world maybe wasn't ready for Baby Bink going international.
Agreed. Okay, let's delve into some of the more obscure trivia and production history stuff Vern dug up. We know it was a financial disappointment and a critical punching bag in the U.S.
Yeah, Vern gleefully reminds us of that multiple times. Box office bomb, critical flop.
It's unexpected and apparently massive success in places like India and Pakistan.
That's truly fascinating.
It really is. Vern notes it became a huge cult hit, leading to multiple remakes in India.
Multiple remakes.
Yep.
Of Baby's Day Out.
Yeah. That detail just makes you completely reconsider the film's overall impact, doesn't it? What was it that resonated so strongly with those audiences? Was it just the pure physical comedy translating well?
Or maybe, just maybe, some of those underlying themes Francis talks about, the class dynamics, the clueless rich, the resourceful, if accidental, common touch maybe that struck a chord in societies with different socioeconomic structures, different perspectives on class and wealth?
It's a really intriguing question. That international success is key, I think, to understanding the film's weird legacy.
Vern also mentions the abandoned video game adaptation. Apparently, there were plans for Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and Game Boy versions.
Wow, they were really planning a multimedia onslaught.
Seems like it. But it got canceled. Vern jokes that this likely spared millions of children from countless hours of probably terrible, frustrating gameplay.
Probably a mercy killing, yeah. Can you imagine a Baby's Day Out platformer trying to control a crawling baby? Nightmare fuel?
And the existence of a children's novelization, too. That further illustrates the attempt to, extend the brand, reach beyond the movie itself, despite that lukewarm reception in its primary market, the U.S.
It's interesting, isn't it, how these tie-ins were still pursued? It suggests the studio, or maybe Hughes, still believed in the core concept, saw potential for a broader family audience that just didn't quite materialize domestically. Or maybe they just had contracts already signed.
Could be. What about Patrick Reed Johnson's other work? Did Verne mention that?
Yeah, he touches on Johnson's filmography. Besides the effects work, he directed films like Spaced Invaders, remember that one?
Vaguely. Aliens Land on Halloween.
That's the one.
Uh-huh.
Also Angus, the teen movie, and later Dragonheart, the fantasy film with Sean Connery as the dragon. So a pretty diverse range of projects, actually.
Okay, and Verne adds this little nugget, this classic touch of Hollywood backstage drama.
Go on.
Apparently, Johnson landed the Baby's Day Out directing gig as a sort of apology from John Hughes.
An apology for what?
For having been fired, or let go from directing Dennis the Menace, which Hughes also wrote and produced around the same time.
No way. So Hughes fired him from one movie, then gave him another one as a consolation prize.
That's the story Verne relates anyway. It's a revealing little glimpse into the often complex, sometimes completely capricious nature of the film industry. Makes the clashes during post-production seem even more potentially fraught.
Wow. And Johnson's later work on Dragonheart, a film heavily reliant on visual effects, certainly aligns with his earlier background in that area, which we talked about. It all kind of connects.
Verne also spots some fun little cameos sprinkled throughout the film. You got to keep an eye out for them.
Oh, yeah. Ooh.
Neil Flynn, the janitor from Scrubs.
Get out of here. Where is he?
He plays a cop near the end, I think. And Kirsten Vangsness, who plays Garcia on Criminal Minds, is apparently in there somewhere too, along with Chief Vic from Psych Kirsten Nelson.
Wow, blink and you'll miss them roles, probably. It's always amusing to spot familiar faces before they became really well known, like finding Easter eggs.
Totally. Now, one more thing from Verne. The music.
Ah, yes, the score by Bruce Broughton. What did Verne think? Let me guess.
He didn't hold back, called it aggressive and even condescending.
Condescending? How so?
He felt it was constantly trying too hard to tell the audience how to feel. Like super sweet and twinkly whenever the baby was cute, then wacky and frantic during the slapstick. He found it really intrusive, like it was underlining the supposed humor or sweetness in a way that actually detracted from his enjoyment or lack thereof.
Yeah, sometimes scores can be too on the nose like that, trying to force the emotion instead of letting the scene breathe.
Exactly his point. Okay, let's circle back specifically to the humor itself for a minute. What worked, what didn't?
Well, the IMDb reviews, the more positive ones anyway, often cite the goofy slapstick as the major draw. Just pure, silly physical comedy. And as we mentioned, the unexpected comedic turns from Mantegna and Pantoliano seem to have landed well with some viewers.
Right, but Verne, our resident curmudgeon.
Our beloved curmudgeon. He remained largely unmoved. Found most of the physical comedy repetitive, predictable, and ultimately just unfunny. He did admit to a few minor moments of amusement, though.
Like what? He actually laughed.
Maybe chuckled internally. He mentions Eddie, Mantegna's character, grabbing onto a bird feeder while trying to cross between buildings and also getting stuck hanging from a crane. Small moments of absurdity seem to land better for him than the constant groin hits.
Okay, small victories. But that running gag of the kidnappers' escalating injuries, that is undeniably a central element of the whole film's comedic strategy, whether you like it or not.
Oh, absolutely. It's the engine driving most of the second and third acts. And Verne does touch on a potentially darker, almost satirical element within the humor, even if he doesn't frame it this way.
What's that?
Just the observation that in this busy, bustling urban environment, the department store, the street, the zoo, a baby crawling around largely goes unnoticed by most of the preoccupied adults. People walk right past him.
Yeah, that is kind of weirdly true in the movie.
And Verne notes it. You can read that as a subtle commentary on, like, urban alienation, everyone's stuck in their own bubble, a lack of community or awareness of others. People are just too busy to notice a baby crawling at their feet.
Huh. Another potential unintentional social commentary.
Maybe. And again, that commenter, Pac-Man 2.0, offers the contrasting view on the humor itself, suggesting that the very absurdity of it, the way it's taken to such an extreme, the falls, the fires, the gorilla, maybe that functions as a kind of subversive critique of similar, but perhaps more treacly and sentimental children's movies of the era.
Like, it's so over the top, it's almost mocking the genre.
That's the idea Pac-Man 2.0 floats. Maybe the extreme, almost violent cartoonishness is the point. A meta-commentary, perhaps.
That's a generous reading, but interesting.
It is, which brings us back really to the core of Francis's argument. The film's unintentional yet surprisingly potent communist message, as he sees it.
Right. Let's wrap up with his main thesis.
He posits that the very fact that the film was so critically divisive that it seemed to lack a clear, singular purpose or tone. Was it comedy? Was it creepy? Was it for kids? Was it for adults? That very confusion actually contributed to its accidental unveiling of these underlying class dynamics.
The lack of a clear artistic goal let the subtext run wild.
Something like that. Because it wasn't trying to be a serious, overt commentary on class, its unintentional insights become all the more revealing, all the more stark.
And Francis really emphasizes this core idea. The film inadvertently shines a massive spotlight on the fact that, quote, the working class is invisible and indispensable.
Exactly. Baby Bink's entire survival, his entire journey, hinges on the unnoticed, unacknowledged labor of countless ordinary people, the bus driver, the construction workers, the zookeeper, the department store lady who he encounters throughout his day. They form his unwitting safety net.
And he argues that the film, maybe through the actions and motivations, or lack thereof, of its characters, inadvertently illustrates how capitalism, as a system driven by greed, like the kidnappers, and self-interest, maybe even the detached parents, fosters exploitation rather than a genuine sense of community or mutual support.
Yeah, the inherited wealth of the elite, represented by Baby Bink, just existing in his bubble, quite literally rolls on the backs or crawls across the paths of the unseen and unacknowledged working class. Their labor makes his privileged existence possible, even when he escapes it temporarily.
And even the resolution, the capture of the bad guys, it doesn't come from the police figuring it out or the parents being clever. It comes sort of from an unexpected source.
Well, the guerrilla deals out some punishment.
Right, the guerrilla scene, which Francis sees as the symbol of the proletariat unleashed. It's this force of justice, or maybe just rage, that operates entirely outside the traditional legal and social structures. A raw expression of power bubbling up from the oppressed, the caged.
It's a striking image, viewed that way. Justice arriving not in a police car, but in the form of an angry ape.
Francis concludes his whole analysis with this really thought-provoking statement, something that sticks with you. He says, even in a movie the critics nearly came to blows over, class struggle really is everywhere.
That's a powerful takeaway. A reminder that these fundamental societal dynamics, these tensions and contradictions, they can be found lurking beneath the surface of even the most seemingly trivial, most commercially driven, most critically derided forms of entertainment. You just have to look.
So there you have it, comrade listener. We've taken a rather unexpected detour through the seemingly whimsical, perhaps deeply weird world of Baby's Day Out.
It's been a journey.
And thanks in no small part to Edward Michael Francis's
unique
Marxist perspective, we've unearthed a surprising amount of potentially revolutionary subtext hiding under all that slapstick.
What looked like just infantile antics and cartoon violence, maybe, just maybe, reveals this potent, albeit almost certainly accidental commentary on class dynamics.
Yeah, the reliance of the privileged on the often invisible labor that props them up, the critique of capitalist ambition, and, of course, a rather angry guerrilla standing in for proletarian justice. Can't forget the gorilla.
Never forget the gorilla. And the film's bizarre journey itself, U.S. flop to international cult darling, that only further underscores how different audiences and different contexts can find completely different meanings, or maybe just different kinds of enjoyment, within the same piece of culture.
Absolutely. Which brings us to the big moment, the rating.
The hammer and sickle rating. After much deliberation, considering its unintentional revolutionary merit.
Very unintentional.
Its depiction of class dynamics, however accidental. Its critique of the lumpen proletariat's doomed capitalist ambitions. And its surprising global resonance. We've decided to award Baby's Day Out.
Drum roll, please.
A hammer and sickle rating of 3.5 out of 5.
3.5. A respectable score for the revolutionary toddler. Higher than I might have guessed going in, honestly.
Me too. But Francis makes a compelling, if sometimes outlandish, case. And the international cult status adds weight.
It really does. Okay, so to leave you with something to chew on, comrade listener, consider this. How many other seemingly innocuous, maybe even critically reviled pieces of entertainment out there might be harboring similar unintentional critiques of the prevailing ideology?
Yeah, movies, TV shows, maybe even pop songs. Things that seem like pure fluff on the surface.
Exactly. They might just be waiting to be unpacked with the right analytical tools, the right questions. Perhaps your next casual movie night, your next channel surf, could turn into your next deep dive into the hidden contradictions of our society. Keep your eyes open.
The struggle is everywhere, remember, even in the toy department.
Indeed. And with that final thought, this has been Marxists at the Movies.
Scene opens, white lights dim down low.
Thank you for listening to the Marxists at the Movies podcast. Don't forget to like and comment.
From shadows deep and screens ignite, the proletariat comes alive tonight. Marxists at the movies, bright and raw, breaking through the reels to rewrite the law. Workers of the world in every frame, changing the